All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Crawford, and it's so lovely to see so many familiar faces, many of whom are friends of mine, but they never come to the Crawford School because they're from the other place that we don't talk about. But we do collaborate with each other, so it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Helen Sullivan. I'm the director of the Crawford School. This event, as you've probably worked out, is being live streamed to our Facebook page. So to avoid any potential embarrassment like we almost had with the Indonesian finance minister yesterday, please remember that if you don't want something to be recorded, don't say it. I'm sure there will be nothing like that today. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the land of the Ngunnawal people, and extend my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This is a really happy occasion for me. I don't get to do this very often, unlike my co-editor, but we are here today to do two things. One, to have a debate about whether robots could replace public servants. And I've had all sorts of interesting emails sent to me in response to that. One of whom rather unkindly suggested that robots will replace public servants once they've replaced academics. And clearly that's never going to happen. So we want to have that discussion, but that discussion comes on the back of the launch of this book, which is a little contribution to knowledge, but took a long time to come together. It's the product of many years' work between myself and one of my co-editors, Helen Dickinson, who's here this evening, and Catherine Needham and Catherine Mangan, who are based in the UK. And it's the product of a number of pieces of work that we've done separately and collectively, thinking about what does the future look like for the future public servants? Who are they going to be? What skills are they going to have? What kinds of careers are they going to have? And can we, with any confidence, predict any of that? And we approached this project in a very particular way, which was that the chapters would be written, some by academics, but many by collaborations between academics and practitioners. So this book has a real practice flavour to it. And I can't remember, Helen, how long did it take to come together, start to finish? 2 years, which is that's not long in the life of a book, really. But yes, so if you haven't yet read it, managed to steal a copy, buy a copy, obviously I'm going to recommend it to you. And we're really interested in your feedback on that, not least because as a result of having done this, we've now embarked on a much bigger project, which is producing an encyclopedia of the future public servant, which is a project we've just started, where the expectation is that this project, as part of the contract, we have to submit a minimum of 500,000 words, preferably 750,000 words. So this is going to be a huge project, and we want as many people as possible to be involved. So we'll be certainly making available information about that. It will be a physical book. It'll be a very heavy physical book, as you might imagine. But as it goes along, it will be published online by the publisher. So this is going to be a living document, as it were. And we're very excited about it, a little bit daunted, but really keen to have people's engagement in that. So that's where we've come from and where we're going to. But this evening, what we wanted to do was to think about this issue of the future public service workforce in the context of digitalisation, AI, all of the things that we know about. And to think both about what public services are going to look like, but more importantly, what kinds of skills, competencies, attributes the public service will need, and could all of these things be done by robots? And so the way we're planning to run this evening is that Helen Dickinson, who is the brains behind many of these projects. I was thinking of a suitable word. We'll talk a little bit about the connection that she sees between this book and the discussion that we're going to have. And then we have some very eminent panelists who have agreed to join us for a panel discussion about the plausibility and the possibility of this. There's going to be plenty of time to have discussion and Q&A, so please do think about the questions you might like to ask, and we'll make sure that there's time to ask them. But before we do any of that, it'd probably be appropriate for me to introduce our speakers and our panel. So I think what I'll do, I'll introduce everybody all together so we all know where we are, and but I won't ask the panelists to come and sit up here until they're going to be having the conversation. So, first off is my rather long-time collaborator and public, I don't know, just extraordinary publisher of all sorts of amazing things, Helen Dickinson, who's currently Associate Professor at the Canberra, I want to call it branch, but I know that's not right, the Canberra campus. Yes, Debbie Blackman's looking at me with, oh dear, in her eyes, of UNSW. And Helen leads the public service research group there, and they're doing amazing work, as many of you will know, on implementation and work very closely with government and at all levels, not just federal government. Helen's published 16 books, so she's no stranger to the art of publication, and over... Sorry? 17. Well, you should update your profile then, shouldn't you? Yeah, well, we can't really say until it's officially launched. Anyway, she's co-editor of the Journal of Health Organisation and Management and the Australian Journal of Public Administration. In 2015, she was made a Victorian Fellow of the Institute of Public Administration Australia, and she's worked in a range of different levels of government and with community organisations, private organisations. She knows a huge amount about all sorts of public service reform and innovation, and one among her many passions is thinking about social policy in a more creative way. So that's Helen. And then we have just the most fantastic combination of people to have a conversation with. Professor Mari Velonaki, is that right? Oh, thank you. Is director of the Creative Robotics Lab and is lead chief investigator in a ARC LEAF grant, which has led to the development of the multi-institutional National Facility for Human-Robot Interaction in partnership with CSE UNSW, which is where she's based, School of Psychology. I don't know what some of these things are, but I'm just going to say them. The ACFR, the University of Sydney, and the Centre... The
Australian Centre for Field Robotics.
Of course, the Australian Centre for Field Robotics and the Centre for Autonomous Systems at UTS and St Vincent's Hospital. Mari has worked as an artist and researcher in the field of interactive installation art since 1995 and has created interactive installations that incorporate movement, speech, touch, breath, electrostatic charge, artificial vision and robotics. Wow. Joining her will be Professor Donald Moynihan, who is the inaugural McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy in the United States. His research examines public sector performance, employee behaviour, and the administrative burdens citizens encounter in their interactions with government, which of course never happens in Australia. He's presented his research on public sector performance to policymakers at the US Office of Management and Budget, the World Bank, and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. And he is, I think it's at least the 3 times winner of the American Public Administration Award. Is that right?
Some of those awards, yeah.
So incredibly well credentialed and one of the best people to read and to talk to about questions of public sector performance. And last but by no means least, and Charles, I'm sorry, I have very little. Your bio is very well disguised, so there was very little we could find out about you. So if anybody knows anything about Charles, please do let us know. Charles McCarty, I have you as the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Human Services here in Canberra. And this is where we get a bit hazy, so we're going to test this out. According to, and we can blame Martin if this is wrong, you're retired from the Australian Navy, is that right? Where you were the Principal Warfare Officer? Wow. Surface warfare. So. And subspecialist in communications and info systems. And now you're in the Department of Human Services. Fantastic. So that's our panel. So you'll see we have practice, we have research, we have expert in robotics, we have expert in public administration. This is going to be a great conversation. So I am now going to do the decent thing and get off the stage and invite Helen to come and give a bit of an introduction about how what we're going to talk about connects to what we've done. Thank you, Helen. I'm attached.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for that very kind introduction. It's not so often you usually say such polite things about me, and I feel that I need to return that, but I feel I'll get over that quickly, so let's move on. So, as Helen explained, my job this evening is to set the scene a bit about our discussion and say a bit about how we came to the focus of this evening's topic. So if any of you have had a chance to flick through the book or have read the book, you'll know that isn't quite as easy as it sounds. So the book makes no mention of robots anywhere. There is a mention of technology in the final chapter where we say we haven't really considered technology in this book. So you might be wondering why we chose to talk about robots to launch this book, and it's a really good question, actually. What I'll attempt to make an answer up to on the spot. So as Helen said, you know, the publishing process is often kind of long and it's a lengthy process before you get to the end product. And the movement on to consider robots and other fourth industrial revolution technologies is an extension of this work that we've been doing for about a decade, so exploring issues around the future public service workforce. And so the book that we're launching this evening tracks some of the changes that we've seen in terms of what public services do and how they go about acquitting these roles. So we argue that the gradual decline of public service organisations as deliverers of services has fundamentally changed the roles of these organisations from one being principally concerned with the delivery of services into thinking more about strategic planning and funding processes. And we argue that in this future kind of context, traditional sorts of skills are no longer sufficient. And there's a really important set of softer and less tangible skills that are necessary in driving a systems approach to public services. And I'll come back to this feature in a second. In itself, that shift would be somewhat of a challenge and mean that public service organisations need to develop new ways of working. But, of course, those changes aren't happening in isolation. So concurrent with those shifts, we've got changing demographics, increased expectations from consumers of services and citizens, the pervasive influence of a 24-hour news media, pressures to operate in more fiscally constrained environments, and a whole host of other sorts of pressures. Now, many of these sorts of themes are really familiar to the public administration literature, which sets out quite a compelling case of the need for governments to change. But one of the things we observed is that's often without very much detail about how public servants would need to operate in this new context and the sorts of skills that they'd need to do this work. And I think also one of the things we pick up in the book is a lot of that discussion often kind of neglects the fact that the nature of work is changing as well. So the idea of people going into organisations and staying there for a career period has really shifted, and people kind of graduating today would expect to go through different roles, different sectors, different institutions, different professional groupings over the course of their career. So the book, as Helen mentioned, draws together a number of different international contributors who write about a range of different themes that we think are important in contemporary and future public services. It includes contributions on really important topics like collaborative working, emotional labour, storytelling and narratives, design thinking, the end of hero leadership, empathy and ethics, diversity and developing and recruiting this new public servant. So all of the chapters provide an overview of the existing evidence base and point to case studies and kind of practical insights about what people might do in respect to these different themes. And so the intention isn't about providing neatly packaged solutions, because they rarely work in practice, but instead to offer a range of different insights that draw from experience for public service leaders and others to really think about when facing the new sorts of pressures in a new public service workforce. So, as I mentioned earlier, the work on robotics is a progression of some of this work in some ways. Having covered some of the ideas around changes to what public services do and how they do some of that work and some of the ways that professionals need to change, I think I see this work as a progression into considering some of the new tools that some of that work will be done through. See, I did make a link, tangential as it might be. And on Friday, the Public Service Research Group that I lead will launch a new report that explores the use of robots in care services. And so we undertook this in collaboration between UNSW, the University of Melbourne and Harvard University to explore the use of robots in care services in Australia and New Zealand and plans for the future expansion of these technologies. And in that report, what we argue is that there's a real lack of strategic thinking around these technologies and the potential for kind of unintended consequences and some of the kind of risks that are involved in using some of these sorts of technologies. And so if you're interested in that, there'll be a piece in the conversation on Friday to launch that, and you can find the full report on the Australia and New Zealand School of Government website who funded the research. So I think where we've seen this debate about robotics and automation in the public sector, it's often been about concerns about widespread job loss that might arise from the expansion of these technologies. And there's often really kind of apocryphal figures of a third of jobs being lost to automation and those sorts of things. And I think there's a number of problems with those projections. We might get to those in the panel discussion. But what's probably true is that some of these technologies will replace routine and repetitive sorts of jobs. So we often hear the refrain that robots are really helpful in places where jobs are dull, dirty or dangerous. Despite a vein of research that talks about middle management jobs in government as being extreme kind of jobs, I'm not sure that the majority of jobs that we envisage in the book in terms of the future of the public service workforce necessarily fall into those categories, although some of them may feel like it at times in the contemporary system. So in setting out the future roles of the public service workforce, we argued, if you remember, that soft skills really are things that become even more valued. So the ability to work across boundaries, to engage with a range of different stakeholders, to operate in a context of responsive regulation, steward complex systems, think strategically, and draw together a range of different evidence sources in decision-making processes, and to construct narratives about reform processes. Now, they're all highly relational practices that require empathy, a clear guidance in terms of morals and ethics and emotional labour. And I think they're things that are not inherent properties of robots, or at least for now, anyway. But this doesn't mean that robots and AI and other fourth industrial revolution technologies don't have a role in future public services. And I think there are clearly a number of really helpful applications of these technologies. But I guess for me, the most interesting bit about this debate is not about the kind of bits where robots replace humans or just humans remain in these roles. It's how humans and machines come together and work collectively in acquitting different sorts of roles. So I imagine many of you who work in public services navigate on a daily basis a full range of kind of routine and repetitive activities that are involved in sorts of complex bureaucratic structures that we operate within. And I guess the key important thing for me is how we engage some of these technologies to help us in some of those activities and work alongside one another. So hopefully that's some background. It's sort of linked the two topics. What are we doing next?
So we're going to explore those. Oh, I need to switch my mic for that one.
So what I would like to do now is invite the panel, which includes you, to come and sit at the front. It's going to be a bit of a tight squeeze, but intimate, yes, intimate. Pick a seat. Silent, get a seat then. All right. So we're going to do a bit of sharing of microphones that will make this work. So what I've asked our panellists to do is to just speak for no more than 5 minutes. They can speak for less if they like, about what they think some of the key issues are in relation to AI and the future public service. And it may be unfair, but I think, Charles, could we start with you as the person who's actually doing all of this at the moment?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, I'll keep half an eye on the time here. Oh, there we go. There's a timer right in front of me. So I'm obviously the man of mystery after the kick-off. Yes, I'm ex-military. Spent 30 years in the military, then came across to the public service just on 4 years ago. Initially in the Chief Technology Officer role, then the Chief Information Officer role at the Department of Human Services. If you're not familiar with the Department of Human Services, think Centrelink, think Medicare, think child support. So we look after all of the very high volume customer-facing transactions for federal government. I also look after and run MyGov as well. So 14.2 million accounts there also. So Department of Human Services, over 21,000 folks dealing with the public day in, day out. We're not really a large policy department or agency. We're a big doing department, and we're all about assessing people's claims for payment and then pushing those payments out the door for Centrelink recipients, Medicare recipients, and we touch about 99.9% of the Australian population because of Medicare in particular. So all of you folks in here would be customers of ours, just about. So with that sort of demand for our services, obviously we're always looking at better and better ways of servicing the public. We spend a lot of time looking at how some of the other large customer service organisations out in industry do it, such as banks and insurance companies, etc. And you probably, in your day-to-day life, are dealing with artificial intelligence already. Whether it's on your mobile phone, dealing with Siri, etc., or dealing with virtual assistants. When you deal with organisations such as the NRMA, Commonwealth Bank, Westpac, ANZ, all of them have virtual assistants, as does the Tax Office, as does the Department of Human Services. So we have 8 bots up and running at the moment. We don't call them robots, we call them bots. Which are digital assistants, virtual assistants as you may, which are there to help you in transacting with our large services such as I just mentioned, Centrelink, MyGov, Medicare, etc. We've got bots to help you in all of those. And the reason we do that is there's an expectation now, and Helen sort of mentioned it in her presentation, that there's this changing expectation of the public now that when you deal with federal government, particularly service delivery side of federal government, it's a 24/7 operation. It used to be 9 to 5, and indeed our telephony services are pretty much 9 to 5. If you ring up DHS, you'll do it between 9 and 5 or 8 and 4, depending on the service. Or you could come into front of house into one of our, just under 400 front of house operations around the country to talk to customer service officers. If you elect not to do that, you'll be dealing with us through MyGov and then coming into one of our member services through MyGov, where if you have a question, you will probably meet up with one of our bots, such as Sam or Oliver. Now, they all have nice names. That will allow you to be able to navigate our public-facing websites, or indeed if you're authenticated through MyGov, if you want to put a claim in or tell us something that has changed in your life, you will deal with one of our bots. Or you may elect not to deal with one of our bots. It's completely up to you. So we like to tend to use the phrase augmented intelligence for our bots. It's not meant to replace any of our customer service officers or our telephony channels, but we see augmented intelligence there to help you in the more mundane and routine tasks, to get a better understanding of the claims that we may have on offer, or to help navigate some of the bureaucratic processes that you may see in federal government services. The bots are there to help you with that level of understanding. One of the bots that we're most proud of is Oliver, that we launched on the 2nd of July this year, that actually helps you navigate a claim for job seeker allowance. So you may have lost your job and you want to submit a claim to be able to assist you whilst you're unemployed. What you used to do was either fill in a paper-based form, or you could do it over the phone and one of our service officers would fill it in for you. What you can do now is deal with our bot Oliver, and Oliver basically takes you through a series of questions and you supply the answers, it asks the questions, it has true conversational dialogue, so it's just like sitting here and talking to me, and it will basically collect all the circumstance data that we need. That will then go to a processing officer, so a decision is not made by a bot. It just helps you in your journey, so it's augmenting what you'd normally expect from a human, and it's just a much better experience for the customer. Rather than filling in a 14-page form and maybe 80 questions, depending on where you go in that question and answer dialogue process, you could be over with quite quickly. So that's where we're using bots, as we call them, digital assistants, virtual assistants. They're all powered by AI, and they get smarter and smarter all the time. The more they interact with the customer base, the better they get at learning from the interactions. We don't allow them to go rogue or by themselves. We spend a lot of time training and configuring them. We're quite proud of our bots, such as Sam and Oliver, and the feedback that we get from our customers, such as thumbs ups, thumbs downs, and general comments, allows us to train and configure those bots to make them more and more efficient. We actually also run, I'm a little bit over, we actually also run one on the inside called Roxy, which helps our claims processing officers process claims. And if you were a junior processing officer, what you used to do in the past is you would ring a more senior one up for guidance. Now your first port of call could be Roxy, and Roxy can help with some of the more simple questions that more junior claims processing officers could have, and we leave the more complex tasks to the humans to do. So that's why we always say it's about augmented intelligence, assisting the humans and allowing the humans to deal with the more complex transactions moving forward, and allow the bots to deal with the more routine, which makes the whole process a lot more efficient, reduces time waiting for citizens to see claims being processed by Centrelink and Medicare, etc. So that's sort of where we're at with our journey at the moment. I can answer a whole pile of technical questions if you want, because that's my bent, but hopefully that gives you a taste of what the federal government's largest public-facing department is doing at the moment. Tax do the same. Tax have their own called Alex, which if you've done your own tax in recent times, you may have interacted with Alex. It's using different technology. It's using Nuance. We're using the Microsoft bot framework and Cortana, etc., but all there for a similar sort of purpose.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we have to go to you next, as the expert in bots. I don't know what you call them, but
I'm not an expert in bots. I'm an expert in I'm not an expert in anything. My area of research is social robotics since 2003. So what is different between virtual agents and robots, social robots, is ours are much slower and they learn much slower and not as fast. They don't adapt easier as the virtual agents. The reason for that is these robots are social embodied AI, social robotics. So because they're embodied, because they have a body and they move in the actual physical space, that creates a big problem. It's very hard to get something three-dimensional to go from here to there. You have to do navigation, planning, a good sensory system. It has to understand. So to interact or perform tasks, it's a much harder way of doing it. Many times we have clients or people from industry that they ask us, I want a robot to do this, this, and that. And said, no, you don't want a robot, you want a virtual agent, because that would be much faster for you and much more efficient. You don't need a physical embodiment unless it's a good reason for it. So what is social robotics? Do you know what are social robots? No. Okay. Social robots, what's the difference between field robotics, let's say, and social robots or industrial robots? Are robots and systems designed to be implemented within social structures. They're designed not to be in factories or special labs, but they're designed to interact with people, with the general public. So that's why we have this kind of different category. In 2006, I felt the urge to start the Centre for Social Robotics within the Australia Centre for Field Robotics, because everyone else was doing submarines and, and rescue robots, and I was looking at human-robot interaction research. What happens if you see three-dimensional embodied agents in different social spaces? Could be a hospital, could be a museum in the context of an artwork. It could be as a teaching robot in terms with special groups, like we have a program with Australia autistic children. It could be rehabilitation. It could be robots for psychological enrichment used in nursing homes for people with dementia. The other thing that is different between, let's say, traditional robotics and social robots is, by definition, social robotics is multidisciplinary. And it is not complementary to have different disciplines there. It is really essential. And it's essential because we're talking about society. And it's a little bit like public service. Public service is there for the benefit of society. So our belief in social robotics, it should be there only if it's to benefit for something, because it's a big word to have society in there. So when you design a new systems, you have people obviously from art and design that they would do the appearance, the robot morphology. You have people that they do the behavioral design, people from materials, psychology, social sciences, mechatronics, AI, and ethicists. And what we're trying to stretch as much as we can is all these disciplines have to be there at the beginning where these systems are developing, not at the end to critique and comment, but have a saying. This is our role when we design things for society. We have to critique, test, evaluate, and the difference between industry and university, that's still most of the universities in Australia are part of the public system, is we can learn what is not working. We can learn what is, for us, I've designed 3 or 4 now with my new robot. I had a robot that created repulsion, but you know what? This is research. It's equally important to have something that is accepted with something that is not accepted, because you've learned from the things that are not working, that the things that different age groups or different social groups are not willing to accept. And I think very vigorous testing is important in these early days. It's a very new field. There's a little bit of danger there. It's a new field that changed the last 5 years from university to industry. So industry started, especially overseas, to invest big money in social robotics. So here we have this child that is not walking yet, it's still crawling, and has a lot of money and funding around it. Not in Australia, but in many other countries. And we need to make sure that we make the right decisions, because we're talking about learning, hospitals, entertainment, education. I strongly believe, and my laboratory believes, not in relationship of replacement. We don't believe in replacing people unless there's a very good reason for it, like mining or like moving people. Our nurses are suffering from lower back pain because they have to carry people. I mean, that having an assistive device that helps the patients, that don't make them worse nurses. They're there to do the human thing, which is hold someone's hand and talk to that person. So we believe that if it's to develop new systems and to be implemented within society, they have to complement and enhance the human experience. Otherwise, they shouldn't be there. Thank you so much.
That's great, thank you. John, you're kind of from the hardcore public admin end, so.
Yeah, and I think how we approach this question, how I approach it, how you would approach it, how any of you would approach it, depends upon the prism by which you view the issue. And quite often, if you think about robots, we often take a prism of the robots as a decision maker or an actor in some fashion. The prism I come to this from is the administrative burdens that citizens encounter when they interact with government. So Helen mentioned this. This is the bit where I plug my book on administrative burdens. It's online, you can buy it. But basically, if you encounter the government as a citizen, you might have to spend some time learning about a service, so there's some learning costs. You might have to fill out forms, the compliance costs that Charles was talking about. There might be some psychological costs if you go to the welfare office and you feel like you haven't been treated well. And the effects of those costs is that for a lot of our public services or even basic rights in the United States, like voting, you see a lower take-up than there really should be because people find the process burdensome and onerous. They might encounter public service actors who are using their discretion to discriminate against them. So my prism is, how can you use technology or robots, however you want to call it, in ways that reduce some of those costs for citizens? And to illustrate the possibilities here, I'm not going to talk about a new technology, but an incredibly old technology. The Social Security program is perhaps the most successful public policy program, certainly welfare public policy program created in the United States. When it was created in the 1930s, nothing else had been done like it on such a scale by the US government or anywhere else. Big pension program. The government had to enroll 26 million people in a little under 2 years. It didn't have enough resources to do this. Some of the models it was copying from Europe were to give people stamp books where they would, fill out their earnings once every 3 months, and then at the end of their working life, they would hand that into the government and presumably start getting a check back. You can imagine all of the potential ways that would have gone wrong. Right? Your employer didn't give you your earning stamps, you lost the book, ways in which it would be burdensome over time. So what the US government did was to create a new technology, which was the Social Security number. It gave all of the citizens who were involved a new identifier, and this was plenty controversial at the time. The US does not have a national identity system now. This is the closest thing we had to it. If you look back at the debate at the time, people were really concerned about this as an invasion of privacy. All of the contemporary concerns we have about the use of administrative data were there at that point. But what it did was enable an incredibly complex program. So the US government is collecting my earnings every quarter. It's partnering with my employer to collect that information to feel to me as a citizen as an incredibly simple program. All I have to do is to give my employer my Social Security number. When I'm 65, I fill out a very simple form and the checks start coming. So it shifted the burden away from the citizen and put it onto the state, somewhat onto the employers, but it's used the disruptive technology at that point to do that. We have contemporary analogs to that, such as automatic enrollment for public health insurance programs in the United States, or automatic voter registration, where people, based on some administrative data that the state has already collected, identifies who is eligible for a program, who becomes eligible to vote, and registers them as eligible for those services, or starts making those services available to the citizens. It's using a mixture of administrative data that the state is already collecting and information technology to shift some of the burdens away from the citizens and onto the state. There are a lot of ethical, administrative, logistical challenges that go along with taking on that role, but at least as a normative framework or guideline about what should the role of the state be as it approaches this question of how we use technology, that seems to be a pretty good starting point. How can we make citizens' lives easier? How can we make sure that they avoid things like discrimination when they go to a welfare office? How can we make the experience simply better? And in general, one of the big concerns we would have about especially things like welfare services or tax reporting is the potential for fraud with self-reported data when people make up information about themselves that might not be completely accurate because they're trying to get access to a service. One of the benefits, I think, of this approach is that using administrative data is often more accurate than the information that citizens will give to you in self-reported information, because they're already providing things like tax information in their employment and tax interactions with the state. So my pitch for people who are thinking about this question is to start with the perspective of the citizen. Think about how we can use technology to make the citizens' lives easier when they interact with the state, and to make government programs that are intended to reach the citizen actually reach them and do it in a way that's not burdensome for the citizen.
Thanks. Did you want to have your 5 minutes?
No, I've had my 5 minutes.
Are you sure? Yeah. Okay, well, that gives us more time for conversation. Thank you all. But there are so many questions. I think the obvious one for me is that, you've all presented a very benign picture. Don, you talked about putting the citizen at the centre. Mara, you talked very much about, the fact that this is a social, should be for social good. And Charles, all of your examples were about, how do we make things easier, better, quicker. And that's all fantastic. Who wouldn't want that? But what are some of the downsides to your rosy picture? I mean, it seems to me that Charles, you talked about the speed with which the bots can learn. What are the implications of that in terms of our reliance on bots, where they may not be entirely reliable? Because it does seem to me that there are some significant risks associated with what's being presented, and I just wonder how you think about those.
Yeah, so one of the hot topics at the moment in the AI space, particularly for virtual assistants, is bias and transparency of decision making. So if you look at the moment, if you were to ring up a large service agency, it wouldn't matter who it was, whether it was a bank or insurance company or federal government, just by the very fact that you could get an answer from one of, say, 21,000 people or 20,000 people who might be answering telephone calls, you don't tend to concentrate any sort of bias. Whereas if you tend to have a small group of people training bots, you can have unintentional bias. And indeed, there's been documented cases of this in the US. So you need to have a continual auditing process of your bots to make sure that they are not concentrating any of the bias of those folks that are training and configuring those bots. And in a way, that is why getting customer feedback is so important. The thumbs up, thumbs down, has this bot answer my question correctly? And you are continually watching and observing the bots to make sure you're not generating bias. If you're using bots for actual decision making, one of the problems you can end up with is if a customer then challenges that decision, how do you provide transparency of that decision-making process when the technology that sits at the heart of AI is the deep neural network? The three core components of AI are natural language classification, so that's the bot understanding the context of the question that it's given, the deep neural network, which emulates what's actually in the human brain, which is the black box bit, and then the other bit is the probabilistic determination that sits at the back end, because normally the deep neural network will come up with a series of answers to the question, and it's got to then make a decision on what is the best question to that answer. So we spend a lot of time tuning that probabilistic determination piece to get it right. But if a question comes up from a customer that says, why did that bot make that choice if you're using it for decision making, that's why we're not doing it.
Yeah.
Because we don't have any way of answering that at the moment. So we're using the bots for general advice and to lead customers through a process, but we're not using it for decision making. The technology's there. Things like TensorFlow, Google's TensorFlow, can be trained to actually make decisions for you. But until you've worked out how to deal with the challenge of people making life choices based on some of that advice, I think we've got a little ways to go. That's my view at the moment.
Sure.
Yep.
Okay. Barry?
That's a great comment, Helen. And although I thought I did mention that I think social robotics, is it on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So I'm half deaf. That social robotics is a field that it's crawling. It's like this young child, and we have to be very cautious. But I need to emphasize one more thing. Okay, this is our approach of a couple of labs that we feel that multidisciplinarity is extremely important. Having ethicists and social sciences working in the same lab is very important. Having people interaction design is very important. Testing vigorously, it is important. Not everyone is doing it. There's still a lot of naivety, and to be honest, most of the things that you'll see or you read about, they're not things happening in the labs, they're things happening in industry. They don't test, they don't pay all these multiple salaries to people just to do research and testing. So, of course, there's a danger, and I think it's a very big danger. The other thing is the implementation. We're talking again about social structure. No one has long-term interaction data between those machines and people. Huge problem. That makes me extremely nervous. I used to praise ourselves. We have the biggest data collection in the world, over 500,000, more than now, 500,000 recorded interactions in 14 countries with robots. You know what? None of this interaction is more than an hour. Maybe they visited the robot twice. So yes, I'm very proud that we have some basic understanding about acceptance within half an hour, comfort zones, how close, how far, interest, engagement. But is it good enough? No.
Okay.
Just one really simple example. Indiana had a welfare reform where they put in place a new technological process that was supposed to facilitate decision-making. The practical impacts of that was that it withdrew discretion from actual welfare workers. And so when they encountered problems that the system wasn't designed to deal with, they didn't have the ability to override the system. So that's obviously a design problem that comes from, I think, sort of the naive application of some of these technologies. But it is a risk when you're applying this in practice.
So I think some of the risks we talk about in the research, as I said, we will launch later in the week. So some of the stuff for us around the creation of data and of information about people. Now, not all robots do this, but increasingly we're getting kind of robots used in care settings with vulnerable individuals, and in some places they can be linked up with kind of smart house systems and things like that. And there's a whole, class of data and information being collected around individuals that some systems may be more secure than others. I only have to think about a couple of years ago, all the stuff in the news about hacking of data through the Internet of Things, and people with smart fridges and things like that gain access to home systems. So I think that's something that's not necessarily being thought about. And in more residential care settings, essentially we're creating a class of data there that we haven't really had before, that there isn't often a lot of clarity about who owns that data. Is it the individuals who create it? Is it the residential care homes who collect that data? What happens when somebody dies? Does that information come out of there, or does it get used in those sort of ways? So there's a series of those sorts of issues around it. I guess the other issue that we've been thinking about is very much something Mari touched on in terms of the kind of long-term interaction between humans and robots, and I guess thinking about the way in which introducing robots to care context changes the nature of relationships. So I guess one of the things that concerns us in thinking about robots in the context of care services is, and then thinking about them as an augmented tool, is that presupposes that we know what we mean when we talk about care. So I think often, if you think back to when compulsory competitive tendering was introduced in local governments in Australia, the kind of, the what goes into different roles and how we cost that was often done in many places by people following a person around who's delivering services with a clipboard and counting the number of things that they do. And I think we often think of care being as a series of different sorts of activities, which doesn't take account of the kind of relational aspects of that. Of what happens there. So I guess some of the things that we're talking about in our research is about not knowing how introducing robots into those relationships changes the nature of those care relationships. And then kind of also issues around equities. So a lot of people we talk to, for example, in residential care homes will say to us, this is not about replacing people, it's about an augmentation, it's about a tool. Yes, to some extent, although when that hits the reality of an aged care sector that has short margins, small margins in terms of profits, and their largest expenditure is in terms of the people who do those caring roles, then for how long is it going to be the case that they're an augmentation, and will they end up replacing humans in terms of human interaction? And then if it does, who's that going to be for? It's probably not going to be for the kind of most wealthy people in the society. And so, robots don't in and themselves create inequities. They're a tool that we use, but that's within a system that, often creates policies for middle-class people who are navigating a middle-class world and not necessarily for others as well.
So I want to pick up on that and put it back to Don, because Don, one of the things that you talked about was the way in which the social welfare reform that you were referring to in the States, that was very much about making sure that risk was held in the appropriate place, that it was, the state was bearing a proportion of risk and the citizen wasn't. The era of new public management was, we talked about choice, but of course one of the consequences of choice was that citizens, users, consumers bore much more of the risk. So where do you sit in relation to AI and this? Who should bear the burden of risk, particularly if, whether we intend it or not, there are likely to be inequities in who accesses what kind of service?
That's a very good question. So the new public management model, I think, very much identified citizens as rational economic consumers. And if they didn't sign up for a service, that indicated that they didn't want it. What we know from actually studying things like take-up of public services is that a lot of why people struggle to overcome these administrative burdens are more issues of human capital. So your educational level, the amount of financial resources, the social network that you're a part of, your just basic persistence at dealing with these systems. It's not as much about economic rationality as the new public management might envisage. If that's the case, then a straightforward conclusion is these systems that we put in place in front of citizens are going to generate inequalities in terms of outcomes. And so a very simple example with automatic voter registration, the people who are least likely to register to vote tend to be poor people who move a lot and new voters, so younger people. And so with a stable system where you ask people to vote, register to vote every few years, the people that benefits tends to be middle-class people who don't move their houses, are in stable incomes. The people it excludes tend to be poor minority younger voters. And so a system that moves some of the responsibilities back onto the state and says, we're just going to take everyone's driver's license information and register them, starts to bring in younger, poor minority voters and reduce some of the inequities that result from the administrative burdens we put on citizens in the first place.
So it's about how you design the thing in the first place.
Very much so.
And Charles, how does that play into what Human Services has done? Because you've told a story which is exactly about what Don's been talking about, using AI in order to make the journey easier, to involve more people. But your bots, I mean, you haven't named all of them, but the names that you've given, you know, they're pretty white European names. So, you know, to what extent is the design of what you're doing informed by recognizing that there are inequities and trying to, given that you work in a system that deals with some of the most disadvantaged people, trying to redress those inequities?
Yeah, so probably two areas. You know, put aside, you know, most of our, well, not all of our customers, but many of our customers do come from disadvantaged backgrounds. It's one of the reasons, you know, they could well be applying for welfare. But there's a couple of other barriers as well. One is language, and the other one is a disability. You know, and we do offer up a whole pile of assistance for those with disabilities, such as disability support pension, carers allowance, carers payment, etc. So we're in pilot at the moment, actually, with language translation in 3 of our largest languages. So that's Arabic, Vietnamese and Mandarin. So, you know, none of that's been announced publicly yet.
It hasn't announced.
Yeah. But, you know, so we're running it in pilot in a few of our centres so that once we've got it perfected, we'll then be able to turn that on with our bots, which helps a whole pile of people where English is their second language. So it gets away from some of that you know, disadvantage that people have just because they can't speak English. The other one is a disability. So, you know, if someone trying to utilise a smartphone or a keyboard and a screen and a mouse, you know, we aim to turn on text-to-speech and speech-to-text. So that example that I talked about earlier, which is Oliver, you being able to use natural conversation flow to submit a claim, it then becomes quite easy to be able to turn on speech-to-text and text-to-speech. So if you have a disability, you know, such as not being able to use a keyboard or, you know, hearing disability, whatever it may be, it then will assist you being able to move from the physical world into the digital world, which we think is fairly important. And it's using technology and AI to enable that. So that's an example of 2 areas where we're focusing heavily at the moment.
Great. I feel that I need to allow the audience into the conversation because I've no doubt there are many questions or indeed just contributions. So we'll go here.
G'day. Harley Dennett from Mandarin. I want to go back to the decision support in human services as just a starting point. If it's just decision support, not decision making, but the AI, the bots are always making a decision in the background that the human can decide whether or not they want to follow, won't the human nearly always, by the nature of the environment, the fact they're in a workplace, the fact they're being assessed, all that kind of stuff, automatically just go with the decision that the bot makes anyway? And if so, is that really independent?
Yeah, so if you look at the flow that may sit around a claim form, if you look at what is presented as a summary at the end for a customer, so I don't know how many people have you know, done their own tax returns, but if you look at My Tax, at the end of you providing a whole pile of information to the tax office, at the end it presents you a summary and basically says, you know, can you go through and make sure that you're happy with what you're submitting? It's a similar process with us for claims submission. So even though that you're dealing with Oliver, our bot, say for a job seeker claim, it is generating, or it's collecting a whole pile of circumstance data from you that you are offering up as part of that dialogue, and then at the end it presents it to you, just like you would at the end of a written claim form or an interview that you may have in front of house, you know, where a customer service officer would present to you, we've filled in this claim form on your behalf, can you make sure you're happy with all of the circumstance data that you've given us? You know, then you sign it and it gets submitted. So the bot is in no way part of the decision-making process for an outcome as to whether any sort of claim could be awarded. It's just helping you through the process. At the end, you make a decision on whether you are happy with what you have told the system, just like the tax office does the same thing, is true and correct. Does that make sense?
Just there, Ma.
Thank you, everyone. That was really interesting. I just want to push the panel a little bit on the question of who these technological developments are for. So particularly in the area of social services, we had a few people saying, you know, that it's for the public service client. But at least in the research that I've done, people often say when they're dealing with the administrative burden of social services, they want to talk to a real human. They want someone they can trust, and they want that person to act like a real human. And it's because of all of those things that Helen was mentioning, you know, empathy, trust, those sorts of softer things. So how much of it is about efficiency and cost cutting, and how much of it is about the client, particularly in the wake of some of the recent Australian controversies like the Centrelink robo-debt issue and the MyGov online health system. Thanks.
So I think those are partly design issues, and design issues is sort of a euphemism for political will about who these systems are intended to serve. So I think there is always a risk that, you know, all of us have been on the phone where we've been yelling at operator because we're tired of the automated system, and we want to have systems that avoid that. With that said, there are still downsides to dealing with human beings. Human beings have biases. So, for example, I'm doing research on a paper now where we've sent information in a Scandinavian country to members of schools, where in some cases we're pretending to be from a Scandinavian family, in some cases we're pretending to be from a Middle Eastern family, and we're asking about getting access for our kids. And you can see really differential responses depending on which family we're pretending to be. One hope would be that some aspects of the design here would be to eliminate some of the potential biases and discrimination that we don't talk about a lot in public administration, but do exist, while still retaining the exit factor when people feel like they're not being served well by the machines in the box. And so there may be some sort of basic design principle there that you can extract from that, but I think there's something to that.
Helen, can I just push this to you and extend that point a little and think about, I mean, it's one of the things that you mentioned. So, you know, the question assumes, perhaps rightly, that the talking to a real human is not just going to give them something that isn't biased, although Don has raised a question about that, but is also going to be a fuller, richer conversation. But as all of us will know, when we talk to people, you know, who sit in call centres or wherever they are, they work to a script, you know, so isn't the capacity for what the questioner is asking contingent upon us having an understanding of what it is a real person is equipped and empowered to do?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, you know, I think we have assumptions about these things and about technologies, and yeah, as you say, in navigating difficult systems, we look for people to help us through those sorts of process, and that's what people want. But as we hear, you know, there are these biases that we have there as well. I guess on this topic, the one thing that probably concerns me in terms of who the technologies are being developed for, as Maury kind of alluded to, you know, there are a lot of researchers who go through and put a lot of effort into thinking about the impact of robots and how they interact with people. One of the things that we kind of observed around, particularly around kind of aged care at the moment, is having gone to a couple of tech kind of startup fairs of last year or so, is there are a lot of people who, when you say to them, well, why did you decide to develop this robot or this product and get into this market, it's because they know that there's quite a lot of money in aged care and disability care and healthcare, and they can't necessarily get the technologies funded in other sorts of areas. And at the moment, the kind of where you do see robots being introduced around, particularly around aged care, they're not necessarily because they've thought really carefully about, you know, a model of care that they have and how it fits with that, and there's a really good evidence base around this. It's about differentiating themselves in a market, and they've been sold a technology by a supplier saying this will, you know, if you can't, if you don't have a way of kind of making your margins better in the way that you operate at the moment, this is going to help you create a bigger market around that as well. So I think there are some concerns about, you know, some areas of industry coming into this and developing technologies that aren't necessarily as kind of user-focused and designed and as kind of well-meaning about navigating that. If you want something.
Because of aged care, situational context is extremely important, and especially in other countries, not in Australia, I think we have testing scenarios within aged care facilities that simply it shouldn't be, they shouldn't be acceptable. Again, it's relationship of that misleading and misrecognition. So I don't want to see some sort of Android robot sitting there and talking to me just because I don't have enough people. I think that's extremely bad, extremely dangerous, unethical, because usually these kind of robots, even in the testing phase, are used with vulnerable members of our society. Many times with people with dementia or some of their senses, they're not fully functioning. So there's this kind of, it's not a choice to connect with this robot because I like it as an object, as a responsive object. It's misrepresentation and therefore very unethical. Now, in Australia, we have something that it's a bit more playful. We have robots that they're not designed for aged care, except Paro, who is designed for aged care. But to me, I don't see it as a danger. I see the mass conversation started. Again, we don't have long-term data, but it's really one more activity with the patients and the carers. I don't think that this kind of, maybe I'm wrong, you know, but we need the long-term data to see what happens. But I don't feel that they're catered exactly for that. And we have to see at the beginning people engaging because it's just another toy, a conversation starter. The same results in University of Southern California, UCLA, with similar robots. But then after a while, people, when they get bored with them. So then it's another question, learning, engagement, intellectual challenges. Yeah.
Can I add one more quick point? Because I mentioned Social Security earlier, and there's a really sad sort of footnote to the story, which is that the federal government is cutting the number of field officers, the number of people who are serving people, on the argument that more and more people will do their business online. And that suits some people. My mother-in-law would much prefer to engage online with Social Security Administration, but obviously does not suit a lot of people who need that extra help, and there isn't technology there to serve them yet. And so I think that is really a good illustration of where technology can sometimes become an excuse to ration access to services. Sorry.
Great. No, that's okay. And there's a question. Is there a question? Yes, you said.
My name's Mick Chisnell from IGPA. Just generally, there is so much I could argue with that we'd have to be here all night. But I'd like to focus on one issue, and that is the issue of complexity. To me, I like people, and I think people have spent a lot of time developing as social beings. The thing that I most like about people is their capacity for dealing with the liminal, with the ambiguous, and their ability to not be robots. Now, we've spoken a lot. Just by the way, I think in terms of the question of this, I think we're in a situation where we're training our public servants to be robots and our robots to be public servants. I think that's what's going on. They're merging. But in the area of complexity, I think you've said things like, well, you know, it's only for the simple cases and so on. And I think we're on the horns of a dilemma because as the complexity increases, then we will depend, and we will grow AI capability that will get better and better and produce an ethical AI capacity, an independent ethical AI capacity. But in the end point of that, we have a non-human ethics. And that's, to me, the end point real problem of this discussion that we should be talking about. We're actually not using human ethics, we're using non-human ethics. We don't do that at the moment because we're not clever enough, but it's coming.
Okay, who wants to take that? So, I'm intrigued by all of it, but we're training. Let's maybe ease our way into it by focusing on we're training. What was it you said? We're training public servants to be robots and robots to be public servants. So, who would like? Charles, would you like to have a go at that?
Yeah, so I'll just complexity is an interesting one, and many. Whether you're looking at the banking sector, insurance sector, many of the service-based industries, some of these claims processing processes can be complex because of the rules that sit behind them. So, like I said, you've got to be able to make sure that you are using these bots for the right reason, and starting to put them in as they are in the US. So if you look in the US, the insurance-based industries over there, they're using AI to help with whether they award or reject automobile accident claims, which you may well be familiar with, where a customer may have a bingle with their car. They'll take a series of photographs. They'll submit their photographs online, and they're using it for basically claims assessment process, which can be quite a complex process. We're not doing that at all at the moment. So I think you've got to be careful where you put these bots in, which use cases you use them for. And indeed, if you look at...
Would you stop going in that direction? If you build a platform basically against it, would you in your organisation, and the business case was there, would you actually make a decision not to go?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, well and truly. This has been a cautious approach that we've taken across federal government, where we're using bots to help in a process and help inform customers, not actually being involved in the decision-making process. And indeed, it is customer choice. People still have the ability to come into front of house, talk to service officers. They still have the ability to pick up the telephone and talk to service officers. But, we're now living in a 24/7 online world, and, many people want to be able to, submit a claim or get advice in the middle of the night. And indeed, if you look at the take-up of people utilising bots across many, many service industries to help with some of their routine inquiries, that's, what customer choice is all about. But, if you've always got the ability for people to be able to interact with a human service officer, I think that's good. And if you take some of the routine interactions, if customers choose not to have the routine interactions with service officers, that increases your capacity then for service officers to deal with more complexity.
Helen, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I guess in the framing of that question, there's something inherently good about humans and inherently bad about kind of robots. Or okay.
Good about humans.
And I guess the idea of there being a separate robot ethics. I mean, ultimately, we're the people who design the robots, and according to particular kind of ethical and framework. So I'm not quite convinced it's as separate. And I guess one of the things that people have talked to us about robots and their use in the context of care services is actually they can be more useful in being more human than humans sometimes, in the sense that if you have somebody with dementia who asks you the same question 17 times in an hour, you might get quite frustrated with the asking of that. A robot does not. Now there's, in the US there's development around robots to try and enhance human relationships with one another, often in those caring kind of contexts. So there's a robot that is used around early onset of Parkinson's that listens, and there's issues with this, but listens to the interaction between a person with those symptoms and their carer, and will intervene with certain prompts if they feel that the conversation is becoming in some way fraught, or there's some kind of dangers inherent within that. One of the biggest arguments around use of robots in aged care is around the fact that, we know, and this Royal Commission has showed us in aged care and disability services, the number of people around the place who are being harmed by the people who should care for them. So, this isn't to say that there aren't ethical issues with this, but I think it's setting it up in a kind of simplistic way. And I think what we need to own what robots do and the ethics and the moral frameworks that they operate within. We can't divorce that and say, well, this has nothing to do with us. If we've created them, they should operate within that framework.
Just on the issue to you, which is the neural learning of robots, we'll get to the point where they become autonomous. We're already talking about autonomous battlefield robots making decisions about who to kill. Right? Now, there is a view, I'm aware of that, that robots will never get to that stage. I personally have a view, do have a view, that we will have autonomous robots making non-human decisions.
Okay, Mary, do you want to have the...
There was a big debate a few years back about killer robots. And it's not social robots, but they're robots. So it's not my field. So they don't socialize a lot. The problem I had, and that's my opinion only, with this debate, it's because there's this tendency of removing responsibility from humans to machines. And I think this is our responsibility. I mean, these robots exist, or they're going to exist, because some people agreed, signed upon, funded them. So sometimes I think it's a very interesting debate, and there's always all these, there was a paper about killer machines and how many thousands and hundreds of thousands of downloads, the evil robot. What about the evil people? What about the people? And I love people. I'm very anthropocentric and mildly technophobic. I shouldn't be saying that. That's why I'm into technology, because I don't trust things I don't understand and build. But again, it's this kind of it's the evil machine that takes over, and all of us sitting there, and people, where are the protests? Where is this debate about who funds what's happening? I mean, this kind of removal of responsibility, I find it so highly problematic. The other thing, back to the nursing homes of mental, which I'm very passionate about, and aged care, is, yes, I agree with you. And my mom suffers from dementia. We're running 2 different programs on dementia with robots. Yes, robots are great in terms of they're there and they don't judge you and there's no stigma. You can tell them the same thing until the cows come home, but they're not humans. And we don't know if they create some sort of pattern of addiction and how many years from now. How do we design them? There's almost 0.5 concern, not more than that, in how we design these things. And it makes a huge difference. How big is it? Does it look like is it a copy of something living, even if it's a pet? Is it something different? What is its identity? How it responds? So to me, it's back to the relationship of replacement. It's okay if it's introduced by the nurses and carers as some sort of a game that can play and there's no stigma, and then removed when everyone else is there. And it's different if we go to the cheaper, better solution that at the moment is very expensive, but in 10 years from now, it's not going to be. So, yeah.
So I'm really conscious that we've gone over time and we need to stop. So
if you've got time for one more question, there's one right here, and it's going to be a real cracker.
Well,
no pressure.
If it could be a short cracker, that would be excellent.
Wow, no pressure. Thank you. It's a fascinating panel. I really enjoyed listening to your presentations. I guess my question is about the picture of the underlying picture of the society that you operate with. And from the presentations, one thing I could hear that, yes, of course, there are areas that we can benefit from robots. Of course, there are jobs that humans do not want to do, or they are too routine, too boring, etc. But I think by proposing robots as a solution, we also accept a certain picture of the society, like inequalities. We accept that there are inequalities, and we are not trying to challenge those inequalities. We accept that the government is very complex. There is complexity. There is a multi-layered bureaucracy. So we are not questioning any of these aspects. We accept these things as part of our picture of society when we propose robots as a solution. So I was just wondering what the underlying picture of society is. The robots can do fantastic things to enhance individual experience, but in a society we also have collectives. So what do they do for our collective well-being?
Okay, so you can choose not to accept the premise of the question, which would be my response, but I'm not on the panel, so...
Sure. So I think there are scenarios in which the use of information technology can have an equalizing force by facilitating access, and I've given some examples of that. So I'll sort of sidestep the premise of your question by pointing to that. More broadly, I'll embrace, I think, the premise of your question and expand it beyond what we've been talking about to say we've been thinking about robots in the context of public servants, and there's another important role that the government plays in a society where we are collectives, which is as a regulatory authority. And increasingly, we rely on third-party providers to provide public services. People can build robots in their sort of backyard right now and do whatever they want with them because we don't have a strong regulatory stance about what it means to have a society with many more forms of artificial intelligence playing a role. I think that's I don't have the answer to what that looks like, but I think there's a huge normative challenge ahead of governments, and that is the people that we elect to decide how they're going to regulate private use of robotics in everyday life. So there's one area where our collective efforts should be at least somewhat marginally attentive to.
So one of the things I'll make mention of is situational disability. So many of you will hop in your car tonight and drive home. You may choose to interact with the AI that sits in your car if you've got a modern car. To be able to flash up the GPS system. It will help drive you to a location. It will help find someone in your address book so that you don't have to pull over in the car and interact. It will do it because you are situationally disabled. You're driving a car. So it helps you then make the choice to be able to carry out a function. And in many ways, the bots that are being built out in the service industry, like I mentioned before, if your outside working hours, so front of house is closed, telephony channels are closed, but you still want to be able to interact, with a bank, an insurance company, government, you are situationally disabled. There's no other way of doing it apart from sort of shopping around the website by yourself. These bots can then help you with that situation, what I call situational disability, just like you choose to do in a car. And, you become familiar with these functions and more comfortable with them.
Okay. Yeah.
To me, I'm not comfortable with the word solution. And I think it's a very bad starting point when we start developing things as solution, because solution to me sounds very dogmatic and definite. And that means this is one solution, there's not many solutions, resolves everything. And it's a very bad starting point. I think just assistive, what everyone has been assisting, enhancing, testing first, multidisciplinary approach. The solution is too assuming. So hopefully we don't design and develop for solutions, but just to improve a little bit something. Thank you.
So it seems to me that we probably haven't changed anybody's minds, and I've been very interested in looking at some of the body language in the room while we've been talking. But I think what this has demonstrated is that this is a very live conversation. This is a conversation that is enhanced by having people who come from very different disciplines, as well as engaging practitioners and academics in these conversations. To come right back to where we started, because of course, as well as buying Don's book, Administrative Burdens, excellent read if you haven't read it. Many of the things that you've raised, and in particular the question that keeps coming back about ethics, is a question that is explored in the book that we're launching this evening. And if you only have time to read one chapter, read Barry Quirk's chapter, which deals with the questions of efficiency, ethics, and empathy. And really it takes head on some of the issues that have been raised by the audience and indeed by our panellists about what does it mean to be a public servant, not a public servant robot, but a public servant in an environment that is changing so rapidly, and what are the key issues we need to explore. And as somebody who has been at the forefront of his profession for 25 years, I think he makes a very compelling case for us focusing both on efficiency, but also paying equivalent attention to ethics and empathy. And with that, I would like to thank our extraordinary panel very much for A, agreeing to come, B, not being diverted by Google Maps, which sent you to the wrong place, and C, being prepared to engage so generously with the audience in the conversation. Thank you.